Welcome. My name is Pam House, and I am the president of the Galveston Bay Area chapter of the Texas Master Naturalist. We are so glad that you're able to join us here tonight, and we're particularly glad to welcome our partners in presenting tonight's program, the Multicultural Center, the Bay Area Unitarian Universalist Church, the Clear Lake Islamic Center, and Changing Hearts and Minds program. This is the second in our series of presentations that we are calling Community AT, or Advanced Training. Our purpose in this series is to explore how our shared commitment to the protection of the natural world is addressed by a wide variety of partners, scholars, and leaders who serve minority communities and communities of color, and to introduce that broader community to the Master Naturalist organization, mission, and projects. We hope that this dialogue will move us closer to the goal of true diversity, equity, and inclusion as we work together to preserve and restore our natural resources. Before we begin, let me just do a brief review of the mechanics of participating in this webinar. Your audio, video, and chat functions are not in use for this webinar, so you're not going to be able to see each other, but we highly encourage you to participate in the webinar. And you can do that by using the Q&A button on your toolbar. Just type your questions and comments there. Jaime has told us that he really looks forward to your input, that it's important to make this a dialogue and not just a presentation. Our moderators, Chris Anastas and Cindy Howard, will read aloud your questions or comments to Jaime, and he'll proceed from there. We are recording this session tonight, and a link will be available from our website for future viewing. Chuck Snyder, our technical engineer for tonight and for most of our programs, will share that link as soon as it's available. Finally, we ask you, as you exit the webinar at the end of the evening, you'll be given the option to complete a short survey. Please do that for us. That helps us in planning our future events and figuring out what we can do better in the future. Now I want to acknowledge a member of our 2020 class of Master Naturalists, Mohammed Nasrullah. This series of presentations was his brainchild, and we can all be grateful for his efforts in making them happen. Mohammed will now introduce us to our presenter. Thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you, Pam, and welcome all of you to this second in a series of 6 of these presentations. I'm honored to welcome Jaime González, who is the Houston Healthy Cities Director at the Nature Conservancy in Texas. He works with communities in Greater Houston to create a healthier, more equitable, climate resilient, better connected, and more biologically diverse region using nature-based solutions. Jaime is one of the more than 20 Nature Conservancy city leads using nature-based solutions to build healthier cities throughout North America and the world. He also serves on the board of directors for the North American Association for Environmental Education and co-founded the Coastal Prairie Partnership. Mr. González earned a master's in education in curriculum and instruction science education and a bachelor's in science and biology from the University of Houston. He has also earned advanced certificates in civic ecology, environmental education, and communications and climate change with health connections from Duke, Yale, and Cornell universities. Jaime has won numerous awards for his work, including the Distinguished Alumni Award from the University of Houston's College of Natural Sciences and Mathematics and the Elizabeth Hull Abernethy Award from the Garden Club of America for outstanding contributions to environmental education of youth. So please join me in welcoming Jaime González. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the introduction and the opportunity to speak with you all tonight. My name is Jaime González. I'm from the Nature Conservancy. And I have a few kind of introductory notes about what I'm going to talk about today, just to kind of set the stage a little bit. But before we do that, I want you guys to to do something with me, and this will make a little bit more sense later. We're going to have some interactives during this presentation. So as mentioned earlier, we want you to put questions in the chat, in the Q&A. We want you to respond to some polls. So for those of you who are going to respond to polls, we'll stick a link here in a second. But what I want you to do for now is I'm going to share screen, and I want you to close your eyes for just a moment. And I am going to see if I can play this out. Now, Mohammed, if you could do me a favor, I'm going to play this, and if you can hear it, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. Can you hear this?
No, I can't hear it.
Let me try resharing real quick. Let's see if I can reshare this real quick. Okay, here we go. Okay, can you hear that now?
No, I
No.
can't.
Okay, well, that is okay. What I'm trying to do here is I'm going to go ahead and put this I'm going to copy this link, and I'm going to put it in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and cut that off. And the reason I want you to do this real quick with me is because I just want you to experience something real quick. So if you click on this, you might be able to hear what I was trying to get at there. So click on that real quick. Give it a quick listen. We don't want you to go anywhere. Just give it a quick listen, and then we're going to come back to that because this is going to figure into our conversation tonight. So I'll give you, maybe like 20 seconds to do that. And then we'll come back and we'll ask you guys how that made you feel. Just give about 20 seconds to listen to that real quick. Okay. For those of you who are able to listen to that, that was a dawn chorus that I recorded in my front yard. I think, you guys can certainly let us know how how that made you feel. We're going to come back to birdsong in a little while because there is something that is very important that's going on there in terms of sounds. So we're going to go ahead and start our conversation this evening by talking about birdsong because the reason it factors into our conversation is that we're going to try to make a case tonight that diversifying conservation, the astronaturalist program, is going to be necessary for multiple reasons. But I don't want us to forget that at the end of the day, we are all humans and we're all human beings and we're coming from different places. But that affinity for nature, that love of nature, that biophilia for nature, regardless of where you're coming from, whatever your background is, how much money you have, what neighborhood you're coming from, how much nature you have where you live or not, is something that's just in us as human beings. So we're going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion tonight, but I don't want you to forget that because it is really an important part of the story. All right. We're also going to ask you to respond to polls. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put in a link for you guys. And what I want you to do is I want you guys to go to this website that I'm putting in the chat. It's menti.com. And if you want to do this on a cell phone, if you have a cell phone, instead of doing it on your computer, you can do that as well. So as I put that in there, basically you just go to menti.com, you type in that code, and you can respond to this first poll. The whole notion of tonight is that we're going to be talking about diversity inclusion in the conservation field, how we can actually get to a different place, and what the benefits of that are, what the challenges of that are. So we're going to start with this poll. And the poll question is, the word diversity is being used more and more in conservation. What types of diversity exist in our community? So we will talk about ethnic and racial diversity. Diversity comes in lots and lots of different flavors. So I'm going to give you guys a minute. As you record your answers, you will start to see answers popping up here. So you can each input 3 things. I'll give you a second to do that, just to see where you guys are coming from, because we want this to be a dialogue. This is really a challenging area. It's an area that we're going to have a lot of trust in one another to move forward in. So we just want to see where you guys are coming from. So income, ethnicity, age, social, probably maybe social status or something like that. Some people are going biological, right? Flora and fauna, gender, religion, race, gender identity. So as you kind of populate this, yes, and a lot more. One of the things that we're going to discuss is kind of the value of having diverse organizations, right? Why we want to pass the torch and close the circle, as I say. But one thing you'll find as people are kind of putting their answers in, and the larger the word, the more people have input that. So if you see race in the middle there, it's really big. A lot of times people code diversity for race, right? Background. That's one that a lot of people don't list oftentimes, which is, what is your experience in life? What is your background? Where are you coming from? We'll talk a little bit about that. Your cultural background, which really shapes a lot of how you experience nature and might be drawn to something like conservation. Socioeconomic condition, and education really shapes how you view these issues. So as we work through this, so much of what we're going to talk about today is racial and ethnic diversity, but I want you to keep in mind that as we go on this learning journey together, 2 things. One is, I'm not here to come down from the mountain with tablets. This is very hard work. I am a learner, just like you guys are. I'm willing to step in and lean in, knowing that I'm going to get a lot of things wrong. So this is going to be an opportunity for us to have a dialogue where there are no real hard and fast quick answers, because this is tough stuff. Okay. Another thing I want you to think about as we do this is that you're probably going to leave with more questions than answers, and that is okay. So I've been teaching in the Master Naturalist program now for 21 years. And if I were to come in and provide all the answers and leave somebody without any questions, 2 things would have happened. I would be overclaiming what I know, because I know something, but certainly nature is too complex for anybody to know anything. And I also would not be doing my job as an educator as well. So you can look on here, we'll give it one last look. Cultural ability, absolutely. Sense of humor and personality, right? Just pure personality. Okay. So let's get in here and let's start this presentation. And we're going to start it off by giving a land acknowledgement. Now, a land acknowledgement, for those of you who have not heard one or delivered a land acknowledgement, is a way of opening up a session by making an acknowledgement of who came before you. So part of diversity is also looking at land and the land and who has been there and who might be missing from this equation, or who might be brought more into this. So I'm going to go ahead and do my land acknowledgement to start off on the right foot. It says, before I present my presentation, I need to recognize that Indigenous peoples have been an irreplaceable presence of this place, Southeast Texas, for over 10,000 years, are still here today and will be here tomorrow. I acknowledge that I'm on the ancestral lands of the Karankawa, the Bidai, the Koko, the Ekokisa, and other native peoples in what is now known as Southeast Texas. I'm also mindful that the foundations of this place were built by the labor of many folks that preceded us, including enslaved peoples and pioneers, and we remember them today, and that these places and spaces are being built by many different people from many different places. Lastly, I remember that this place is shared with over 10,000 species of indigenous plants and wildlife, and they too are members of our interconnected living communities and deserve their space and their place as well. So when I talk about Houstonians, I mean all the living beings in that area. for consideration of planning or projects or things like that. So it's not just the humans. Diversity is also, as somebody put it, it's also about the other species that we inhabit this space with. All right, here we go. All right, so I've kind of broken this talk up into several sections. There are 2 more polls. There's 1 video clip that we'll watch, and hopefully we can keep this going. But what I have asked the moderators to do tonight is to do this. I do want to keep this a dialogue, so I don't want to eat all the time up talking tonight. What I want to do is I want to provide some vignettes, some learning, and I want you guys to put questions in the Q&A. And what I've asked our moderators to do is if they get a nice juicy question is don't wait till the end. Let's go ahead and surface that, talk about that. And so that we can have more of a dialogue. I know in webinar, it's a little bit challenging sometimes because we can't see everybody, but this is our attempt to kind of get a dialogue going, okay? So if I'm going too quickly or something, throw a question in the poll, we'll discuss it and get some reaction and then move on, okay? So let's go ahead and start. And the reason I entitled this Pass the Torch, Close the Circle is that I'm hoping that we can have a little bit of a dialogue as to who is going to inherit this work of conservation, trying to save wild places, wild species, but also the love of the land, the love of these species. Who is going to take that and who already has that, but maybe not included in our spaces, right? This love of land, but maybe they don't feel included. And then closing the circle is really about bringing together a couple of groups that want a better environment. Now they're coming at this sometimes from different places. So we're going to talk about that. And closing the circle is really making sure that we do everything that we can for diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice on the conservation side to invite those folks over for a dialogue, to meet them where they might be, and for us to see them as thought partners and folks that we can lean on, but also that they can lean on us, and that we have each other's interests at heart, we hear each other, we listen to each other, and maybe we can get to a point where we actually don't have 2 environmental movements. We have 1 environmental movement. It's really about creating healthy environments for people and the rest of nature, right? But we're going to start this conversation with my particular background, just because it is relevant to the work that I do in terms of you understanding my perspective. So when I was a boy, I lived in a very wild space until I was through 8th grade. So I lived just north of Houston in a place called Aldine, which if you know where Greenspoint Mall is, it's around that area. And my boyhood home was incredibly rich with nature, and I needed it. It was a de-stressor when I was in middle school. You know how stressful junior high can be. But it was also the place where I found an affinity and a love for nature. And it's the thing that really ultimately led me to a career in conservation, partially. So I had prairies, didn't know they were called prairies. We called them fields. I had a forest, a mixed pine oak forest behind my house. We had green bayou. I spent all of my time outside. This is not an uncommon story for naturalists and conservationists. And so when you looked at my backyard, this is still my parents' house. This is what I looked at. So I heard bird sounds. We didn't have air conditioning until I was 12. So we had the windows up. The soundscape of my childhood were mourning doves and cicadas and all that stuff. And I was very much into Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. I was all about wildlife all the time. And that's really where my focus was. It was about these natural spaces and species, and that's how I thought of nature. Fast forward to 1986, oil crash. We decided to move back to Philadelphia where I was born, but hadn't lived since I was 6 months old. So we moved here to a block in what is called North Philadelphia. North Philadelphia is a place of a lot of cultural happenings, and the people there are pretty closely, tightly knit because it's a lower income neighborhood. People rely on each other. They're very generous. There's a lot of cultural things that are happening there and a lot of cultural pride. And so the people I found to be really kind of, even though it was a very challenged economically, And there were certainly many other challenges in this neighborhood. I found the people to be really awesome and very authentic and very generous, and the culture to be, something that I learned a lot from folks. But the physical environment was this. And so I lived on this block for 4 years, going to high school. And as you can see, there is not a stitch of nature here. So I went from very nature rich to very nature poor. Even though the people were great, this is not a great situation. This is a situation that is a nature deficit situation. And these spaces are not neutral for human health and well-being. They heat up hotter in the summertime, they stay colder in the wintertime, but they also have deep psychological and physical manifestations of health and well-being. So the research shows that places like this with lots of hardscape actually are damaging to self-esteem, self-efficacy, and other measures, right? And the reason I'm bringing this up is I saw very clearly what having a nature-rich environment meant and what having a nature-poor environment meant in my own personal journey in life. And so it made me really want to work in eventually in a space where I was helping to bring nature to folks that deserved it but weren't getting it, disinvested communities, but also to bring kids from these spaces to natural places. So I got my first job at the Houston Arboretum and Nature Center, and I worked there for 7 wonderful years. My job was to be the first bilingual naturalist on staff and to work with a really wonderful group of kids from Wharton Elementary. And this was really to diversify the audiences that we served at that time. This is in the late 1990s, early 2000s. This is in the middle of like Memorial River Oaks. So it's not naturally a place where lots of lower income folks, or even at that point, a lot of people of color visited necessarily. And we wanted to diversify that because I had a really wonderful boss, Ruth Milburn at the time. So I was actually hired in many ways to work on DEIJ issues as my first job, full-time job. I didn't think about it that way. At that time, I really thought about, I'm here to teach people about trees and birds and insects and get them excited about that. And I'm here to manage these ecosystems. But I didn't really think about the larger cultural context of this, or how these spaces might not always be welcoming to people of color at that time. It took a long time for me as an ecologist and a conservationist and an educator to go past what are species, what are ecosystems, what is basic nature education, to get to a fuller view of how all of these things are so intersected: the history of the land, the complexity of relationships with the land, the fact that some people have been included and some others have not. And it's also taken me, I'll just be honest with you on my personal journey, it's taken a while for me as a person of color to feel safe enough in my career to be an advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion. When I came in, it was not spoken explicitly. The understanding was that there were very few people in the spaces that I went to at conferences and where I worked that looked like me. So I was trying my hardest to fit in as best I could. Now, and so that really goes to the point that as we look to diversify and make the conservation movement, master naturalists, and other institutions more inclusive, we have to remember that not everybody's coming from the same space. And that one of the big goals is to make spaces more inclusive and make spaces feel like everybody might be more welcome, right? Let me just talk about this guy real quick. I think many of you guys recognize this person. There are 2 people here that are noted early conservationists. There's TR, Teddy Roosevelt, and there's John Muir. And so in many ways, the modern environmental movement, from a Western perspective, started in around the 1870s, 80s, when John Muir was advocating for the establishment of Yosemite National Park. It took him about 25 years, or it took him about 20 years, I think, to get it really finalized in 1890. And really the upshot is that in his mind, he was seeing nature felled, forest felled, areas marred by mining and things like that. So really the first kind of conservation movement was really built around this notion that quote unquote pristine nature was what we should be saving, and these should be saved for posterity, for the American people. Now that wasn't always like as broad as we'd hope it to be, for sure, but that was really the main intent. People were harming nature. Let's save nature from people by designating these safe spaces and then keeping some people out, right? So that spurred a whole movement of land conservation that has achieved a lot of different things. And the Nature Conservancy is one of those groups that has done tons and tons of conservation. So we say places like this is our Mad Island Marsh Preserve. It's a beautiful place of exceptional biodiversity. It's actually the Christmas bird count in the whole nation that typically registers the most number of bird species. In Texas, we have done things like this. Sometimes we purchase the land and hold it and manage it as best we can. Sometimes we give it to other people, or we assist them in getting the place in the first place. So some of the most iconic spaces that you can think of, like Guadalupe Mountains National Park and Big Thicket National Preserve and Enchanted Rock. These are places, iconic spaces in Texas that we help to conserve and then passed on to a state agency, federal agency, something like that. So the history of conservation in Texas is pretty rich, and it's got a lot of achievement. And we are actually getting close to saving our 1 millionth acre at the Nature Conservancy in Texas, which is really great because that's out of the 1.87 million acres in Texas that have conserved, we are partially responsible for almost 1 million acres. That's great. So that conservation movement of saving spaces, saving birds with Audubon Society, saving this wild nature for posterity's sake was well situated, oftentimes pretty well funded, and almost exclusively done by white folks. And for the longest time, that has pretty much held true as a general marker, both in the broader context of conservation throughout the US and in Texas as well. It's been mostly the enterprise of a select group of people. At the same time that all of this was happening, back in the 1970s, folks were coming online like this gentleman right here, from a different angle. This is Dr. Robert Bullard. He is a exceptional thought leader. He works at Texas Southern University. He now heads up the Robert Bullard Center for Environmental Justice, and he's just been named a UN hero. Well, Dr. Bullard came at the health of the land, the soils, the waters, the airs, from a different place. He really came at it from a sense of justice. Who was given good air and land and water, and who was not? So he wrote a very foundational book in environmental justice called Dumping in Dixie, and basically it used as its test case what was happening in Houston, Texas. So the environmental justice movement, some people don't know this, some of the fundamental seminal work to create the environmental justice movement was done here in Houston. And it was done partially because when Robert Bullard, he was the first person to look at like where are dumps located that affect soil and air quality and all that stuff. In Houston at the time in 1978, about 25% of the population was African American, but 80% of the dump sites were in African American neighborhoods. Statistically, that's not possible as just a random thing, right? So this was done intentionally with issues around race and class and who could afford to not have that in their neighborhood and who didn't have the power to do that. So what you had is and this is great oversimplification, is you had these two movements, one really centered on saving wild places and wild things, mostly led by white folks. And then you had an environmental justice movement that was necessary because of air, water, soil quality issues that were being disproportionately impacting communities of color and poorer communities, and some white communities that were poorer as well. So I think part of what I would love to see is, because at the end of the day, both of these movements are concerned with a sustainable, healthy earth for living beings, is to close this circle. And we're starting to see that, and we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the presentation. But if we can close this circle for everyone to understand that all of these things are so intersected, that when you do conservation, when you work on the land, it has justice and equity issues almost always embedded in it. Even if you're saving just wild nature somewhere, there are people that are getting access to that or not. There are people being impacted by those lands or not. And so there's always equity and justice issues in terms of conservation. When we talk about environmental justice, because they're working for air and water and soil quality, there's always impacts on biodiversity and nature itself. So these are intersected, even though the folks are coming to this from two different places. All right. And to prove how intersected this is and how conservation really should be leaning in even more than they are in terms of this intersection between human health and well-being and justice and biodiversity conservation, this is about as clear as it gets. This is done in a UN report that looked at the potential for losing 1 million species in the next few decades. And it's going to read this because it needs to soak in because a lot of people think like if we lose those 1 million species, it would be bad, but we could probably, be okay. Truth is, it says current negative trends in biodiversity and ecosystems will undermine progress towards 80% of the sustainable development goals related to poverty, hunger, health, water, cities, climate, oceans, and lands. At the end of the day, as the wildlife goes, as the flora goes, we go. So there are these intersected, and it says loss of biodiversity is therefore shown to not only be an environmental issue, but also a developmental, economic, social, security, and moral issue as well, because we are so interlinked together that when we destroy biodiversity anywhere, whether it's in the heart of a neighborhood, whether it's at a massive scale, at a regional scale, or even a national scale, what it does is it puts people at risk, either for enhanced issues from climate change, water scarcity, sometimes storms, landslides, and sometimes it's just the loss of the wildlife species that help to regulate all these systems. And so as we have these conversations between conservation, environmental justice, and social justice advocates, one of the things that I'm hoping to really kind of bring forward is just some of this data and these interconnections between how all of this stuff is connected. And that if we want to save the birds and the wild spaces, it's going to have all of these connections with it. And so leaning into these conversations is going to be very necessary for a number of reasons. That's one. Another reason we need to connect the dots with environmental and climate justice and diversity inclusion, just to get people outside connected with nature for nature equity, is that we're all a part of a system. So this is the greater Houston region in the way that I see it. I don't work in the city, I work in a region, and I do work in a city that's embedded within a region that has common issues with flooding, with climate, with heat, with biodiversity loss, and everything that attends that. So sometimes I get called the city guy, but that's not actually true. I'm actually a regional guy that's working to uplift both human health and well-being and biodiversity simultaneously, oftentimes by including or embedding more nature into places, right? And there is a model that I use called One Health and Well-being. I did not come up with this. I'm still learning this. But basically, it is this notion. Anywhere where we work as master naturalists, as conservationists, as environmental justice advocates, there is such an intersectionality between all of it that it impacts those other sectors, whether we know it or not, those other Venn diagrams. And that the past and the present and the future are always in dialogue. So what happened here in Houston back in the 1830s is still impacting what is happening here today in terms of who lives where, who gets what resources, all of that. What is going to happen in the future in terms of climate change is impacting the way that we're planning now, which species we're planning, how we plan for floods and things like that. So these three, what I say is the past, the present, and the future are always in a dialogue to negotiate the present. So in order to understand basic ecology, conservation, what land could or should be saved, where people need park space or not. You have to understand the history of this place, which is complex. It's oftentimes very difficult history to read and to daylight. But without doing that, you are only working with part of the puzzle, right? And so this work is hard because it touches on why certain groups of folks, not just racial, sexual orientation, women, and other people who have been excluded from places within organizations and within the movement, right? So let's get to why we need to have a more diverse conservation movement. Well, one is just basic math. So if you look at diversity of Houston, it is off the charts. So Houston is diversity capital of the USA, and here's why. We're the most ethnically diverse major metro area in the country. A lot of people are surprised by that when we say that. And when I say major metro area, I'm talking about Galveston, about the Houston-Galveston region. We're also a biological hotspot on the planet. So as you guys know who participated in the City Nature Challenge this last April, we came in first for the third year in a row in the USA for number of species observed and number 3 in the world. You don't get that by accident. We are in an exceptionally rich biological area. So we actually have incredible human diversity and biological diversity. But here's one take-home point. The demographics of Texas are changing and have changed rapidly. Sometimes we talk about demographic shifts happening in the future sometimes. I'm here to tell you it already happened, and if you missed it, here's an update from the field. If you look at kids today, there are 2 things that really pop for me. One is that the average child only gets outside for about 10 minutes of unstructured playtime a day. Well, that has serious implications for the trajectory and sustainability of the conservation movement in Texas, because if you don't do 2 things, find nature all the time and play with it, and find a mentor, an adult that models pro-environmental behavior, it's hard for you to get that conservation ethic. So that's one important thing. But here's something also in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, and how we need to pass the torch and work with folks. You look at the demographics for Greater Houston, 90% of the children in Greater Houston, 18 or under, so youth 18 or under, are children of color. Let me repeat that. 90% of children under 18 are children of color. So although the conservation movement has been mostly funded and supported and initiated by white folks, and that's been great, that those folks have stepped in, there's just a numbers problem there, right? So we have to be able to train up, teach up a more diversified suite of people to be advocates for nature and to be advocates for their own nature in their own places. But we also have a real possibility to do this. It's never a one-way conversation. We also have a great ability to learn from folks who have not been included in our spaces. They have so much to teach us about how this world works, what's important to them. Their perspectives really enrich us, right? So that's really, really critical. And this is why we're going to go into this second poll, because we do need to diversify, because the movement right now in terms of ethnic and racial diversity is not sustainable over the long term, right? So if we want to continue to protect these places, pay for these places, that's going to be a major consideration moving forward. So it's both the morally right thing to do, and it's also the strategically right thing to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to our second poll question. So you're going to go right back, and if you have to refresh your browser or just go to that website again, you're going to use exactly the same code. And the question here is, where do you believe it's most important to see more diversity, inclusion, and conservation? So if you guys are just coming in the chat, you'll see it's menti.com, and then it's that code, and people are already responding. And And let's take a look at what people are saying here. Because this is the real question, is we think about how do we make these changes in conservation? How do we diversify and make these spaces more inclusive? Who are we talking about? And what are we willing to do, and where will folks find a place, right? And this is not a trick question. This is a conversation starter, okay? So as we can see, we have guests who are served. And as we talk about this, I will say that this is traditionally the way that conservation groups have seen diversity. Who do we teach? Which communities do we work in? You know, who is being served by our work, right? And that is a very traditional way of looking at it. When I was at the Arboretum, that's how we measured it. We did not measure what was the diversity of the staff, what was the diversity on our board of directors, what was the diversity of supervisors on our staff. But what I will say is this: as we have all learned more about diversity, equity, and inclusion, diversity in leadership is one of the most effective things that you can do to spur diversity and inclusion initiatives. And it's for a very good reason. Folks who have a lived experience, who come from a certain perspective, who are from ethnic or racial groups that have not been represented, or LGBTQ folks, or other people, having them on boards, making decisions, writing budgets, is critical for pushing this forward. So sometimes what groups do is they decide that they're going to get more diverse, and so they try to reach more diverse audiences, but they don't do the hard work of looking at their donors, their boards of directors, their advisory boards, and that kind of stuff. And like I said, there are no perfect groups out there. We're all working on this stuff, and we're all learning every day. But I would say that when you take a look at how brown and black folks come to these spaces, if they don't see staff or other people that look like them, it doesn't mean that they're immediately out. But what it does do is it signals that that is an okay space for them, and that might feel more comfortable. So sometimes we lose a lot of diverse candidates who come in and start to work because they don't feel like they see anybody around them that looks the same. And so they don't feel maybe as comfortable as they might. So it's really an important thing to have at all these different levels. I will say, in terms of donors and supporters, that's really a growth area for conservation right there. We don't have, in general, diverse suites of donors, and we need to be cultivating donors because that's a long-term process, right? So we need to cultivate more diverse donors, and what that means is meeting them where they are in terms of their interests and things like that. All right, I'm going to get out of here. Great, thank you for responding to that poll. All right. So I think we got a couple of questions. I'm just going to see. Oops, wrong place.
We really don't, Jaime.
Okay.
We had questions about where to find the poll, and we answered that online. So we don't have any real questions for you yet.
Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about intersectionality and kind of draw on this thread a little bit. And then we're going to get to some bright spots. I want to leave you some bright spots, and I want to have some question and answer about how we do this work, and some of the parameters for like how we should ask questions and maybe even interact. So one of the things I would say is, like I teach all of my Texas Master Naturalist students, so when I'm teaching prairie and wetland systems, is that you have to be able to understand the history of the land, like CSI almost, in order to understand what you can do with the land now. Because if you don't understand the history of the land, you may be making some key restoration or conservation errors based on the fact that you don't know what happened before, and so you might be misreading the land right now. So that's part of the Jedi skill set of a master naturalist, is if you can look at a piece of property and say, I think I know, at least in broad strokes, what happened here. Well, Houston is one of those places. The Houston-Galveston region is one of those places. There are all of these historical processes which undergird what we see when we go to communities that maybe are experiencing these issues. I had a wonderful opportunity to present at the International Wildlife Conference this last year with a number of folks, including Dr. Natty from North Carolina State, and he wrote up this incredible analysis with a couple of other folks. And what was striking about this was that when we look at this connectivity between social and racial justice and climate justice and biodiversity, the link is really tight. So we tend to think about biodiversity as like outside the city, and and then there are certain urban issues and things like that. The truth is, there's a very tight clustering. So we see that in places which have historically seen systemic racism, like redlining in the 1930s, land displacement, those kinds of things, or underinvestment of park space in brown and Black communities, that you can literally see it from the biodiversity that is absent there, right? So there is this dynamic where there's never any separation between biodiversity conservation and what we choose to do to the land and who has power over the land and all of that. No matter where you do it, whether it's a state park, a national park, a nature center, there were people on that land that preceded whatever that entity was. And it's important to kind of unearth that. Yosemite is a great example of that. A lot of people still don't know that Native Americans were displaced to make Yosemite National Park. It wasn't this pristine, untouched by man place. Native Americans had a long history of inhabiting that space. So even at the foundation of the conservation movement, there was lots of displacement of indigenous folks, both in North America and Africa and Australia. So all of these issues are super, super intersected, right? And in places like this, so one of the things that I'm working on right now is who gets nature, right? Who has the right to nature? And I say that everybody has the right to nature. In communities like this, and this is actually taken right by where I used to walk home from school up in Aldine, we're looking at where can trees be planted to cool off an increasingly hot city? And what plant palettes can we use to do that so that we can uplift biodiversity while we're cooling the city, right? And so what we find, not surprisingly, is that the neighborhoods that have less money and influence have less nature. And because they have less nature, they have less biodiversity. And because they have less biodiversity, fewer chances to authentically engage with the biodiversity that would make people excited to be conservationists or volunteers with the master naturalists and things like that. So it's all a chain of being. So you're probably wondering, like, okay, so what do we do about all of this stuff? Well, we already alluded to the poll that one of the best practices is listening, right? A lot of times, and I am emblematic of that, we want to get in there and we want to solve a problem. We're just going to jump in there. And sometimes what that has done in the past, and I fault myself for this, is we go, well, there's a need in that community that we've identified. We're going to jump in there and throw money at it and throw personnel. That's an outdated way of thinking. Really, in many ways, the community, in all ways, is the expert on where they live, right? So as we're looking to build more relationships with more diversified communities, whether that's racial, religious, economic, sexual orientation, whoever that is, the best thing I'll say, and thing I'm working on literally is I'm working on listening skills, is they have lots to offer in terms of perspective and wisdom and community knowledge, right? You have skills and knowledge and things to impart as well. So dialogue is really the antidote for much of this stuff, right? But there's also things that can be done as well. And that's one thing, is to recognize that although communities of color have disproportionately been impacted by environmental justice issues, that's not the only reason that they want more nature or more exposure to nature. Just like all human beings, folks in these communities, they want more trees because they're beautiful. They want to see butterflies because they're magical. So, so it is as we work with communities that maybe have not found spaces in volunteer ranks or in some of our public green spaces and things like that, just keep that in mind, that they're coming from they might be coming from a different perspective, but all humans have a biophilia need. We all have that. And that's seen in lots of different places. I'm going to show you this. There are a couple of studies that are really neat. One was called The Nature of Americans. And if you haven't seen this, it's a little bit, it's not dated. It was done a few years ago. But they did a nationwide survey on people's beliefs about nature and the benefits of nature and who's using nature. And they did certain state snapshots. And Texas Parks and Wildlife fortunately paid for a Texas state snapshot. And here's what makes me somewhat optimistic that we can turn this corner and make a movement which better reflects the communities in which we live. One is that when we look at these measures of who thinks that nature provides lots of benefits, if you take a look at that middle column there in terms of highly important, look how high that Hispanic or Latinx score is. It's way up there. So many folks in the Asian community, in the Hispanic community, in the African American, they already have pro-environmental viewpoints. They like nature. They like congregating in nature. If you look at Herman Park, that's a really good example of a space that's kind of been transformed for larger groups that Latino, Latinx families congregate in. Parks and Wildlife has literally redone some of their common areas to accommodate this different cultural shift with Latinx folks and some Asian communities as well. So that's good. And then we have things like this America's Wildlife Values report, the state report. And I'll add these to an email that I'll send to you later. Basically, the upshot is this: the researchers categorized Americans into 4 clusters of folks. And what they found is that the more urban you were, and the more likely you were to be a quote unquote mutualist. That means that you see nature in your moral universe, so that you don't see it completely as utilitarian, like to meet your needs. You see them as beings that need protection as well. So as we've gotten more educated and more urbanized as a country, that has been a real challenge for conservation because land continues to get gobbled up. But what we're finding is, because Texas is 87% urban, a lot of people still think we're very rural state, but in truth, we're an urban state with some rural populations, 87% urban, but a lot of those folks actually have more kind of mutualistic values around nature. At the same time, the hunting population, the fishing population in Texas is going down, and those folks are typically what has funded the conservation movement in Texas, especially Texas Parks and Wildlife. So we got these things happening where we're getting increasingly urbanized and brown in the state, and with different value sets and different perspectives, sometimes the same, and you have a declining base of support that has typically brought the conservation community here. Okay. And also this fact. We know that where we put nature in, it has many physical, emotional, spiritual, and cultural benefits. So the reason I had you listen to that dawn chorus is this: it was just a report that was released that looked at nature sounds and their ability to make us feel better, particularly in times of stress like the pandemic, or if you're dealing with chronic stressors like poverty or illnesses or things like that. What they found was the most kind of effective nature sound is bird sounds. So it has a really calming effect on people. One of the communities I'm working in right now is called Gulfton. It is our Ellis Island. There's no neighborhood in Texas that has more ethnic diversity. It's an immigrant community, a lot of apartment dwellers, incredible diversity of people, amazing people. But like my neighborhood in North Philadelphia, very, very nature deficit, right? So I went around the neighborhood, made 900 iNaturalist observations, and counted 10 birds, individual birds in 2 days, right? So what we have is a situation where the folks who might really benefit from nature because they are adapting to a new country and there's stresses with that, or they don't have as many resources, or they're living in these apartment buildings that may not have as many services. Those folks have less nature to help them mitigate the stresses of everyday life, right? So so as we work on a plan with the community, having the leading voice, we are thinking about these things. How can we as traditional conservationists and naturalists bring the power of nature to a community that needs it, but also at the same time, listen, think about and listen to their definitions of nature and land and what they want, because we can't come in with our prescription for them. And I think that if we do that, we will get to this meeting space where we can correct environmental justice and climate injustice and have biodiversity and have conservation and create these garden-like cities that meet the needs of people, biodiversity, and at the same time, to help us diversify by training up kids from diverse backgrounds, by encouraging folks to have green businesses to meet these needs, having more volunteers, and also paid internships, which are super important for people that might not be used to these spaces. We might want to make it as equitable as possible. And lastly, I will say this. As we make this journey to make our conservation and environmental communities more reflective of the communities in which we live, in terms of who we serve, in terms of our volunteers, in terms of the staff that we hire, in terms of all the layers of leadership, there are groups that are taking that chance. They're leaning in and saying, you know what, we're coming from this conservation, nature recreation background, but we understand that we're going to meet communities where they are, and we are going to share. We are going to break bread together. We're going to go through the hard work and the difficult conversations and the scariness of some of this to lean in. These are some of those groups. Some are religiously affiliated, like the Green Muslims, or the Interfaith Environmental Network of Houston, which is a non-denominational, every faith is included thing. And I helped to start that a while back. And it's because what we have is in Houston, you know, in many ways, we're not leveraging our great strength, which is diversity. So conservation community doesn't always have a great relationship with the faith community, even though this is one of the largest faith communities in the country, right? We don't always have a great relationship with brown and black communities, even though we have a really dynamic and rich black and brown community. So these are some of the groups that are leaning in. I will tell you, I work with a lot of these groups. We're doing hard work. It's not always successful. We sometimes miss cues or misunderstand people. We misunderstand each other. But it's all necessary to get to a place that's sustainable and livable and has all the stuff that we care about in terms of human justice and equity and making sure that people are healthy, that they're taken care of, but also making sure that all that biodiversity and those natural spaces that we adore and love also continue to have voters and donors and volunteers to help keep them alive, because we all know in a place like Houston, if you step away from natural areas, they get sick because we have changed the dynamics. They get infested with invasive species, they get overgrown, prairies go away. So we need as many people as we possibly can to be engaged in this work. And that's why I say that when we're talking about issues of diversity and inclusion, some people who have been in conservation for a while, they get a little bit fearful that they're going to get written out of the script. And what I tell people is no one's getting written out of the script. We're just inviting more actors onto the stage, right? The challenges that we face with climate change and biodiversity loss and environmental justice in a warming, more floodable region, they all demand that we have more people engaged, not less people. So we need everybody that we have now and many more. And so hopefully this is the start of a conversation with you guys. Last point I will leave you with before we take Q&A is this. After the murder of George Floyd, what we saw was an intense, as you know, conversation, very public conversation about race and class and equity and all this stuff. very shortly thereafter, the local conservation community, local environmental community, national, state. I was working with a lot of different people, folks and agencies that had never really focused on how do we make for a more equitable and diversified movement were all of a sudden very, very interested in it. And many, many groups formed diversity, equity, and inclusion committees. They're like, we are behind on the times. We have not reflected the changes that have happened in terms of our board or our staff. And so now we're going to get busy. So they all created their own efforts. I'll tell you that most of those efforts stalled out because what happened was people got into the work and it was much harder than they thought it was going to be, because it's sticky and it's hard. And so what I have taken to suggesting to people, because I've seen this model work both here locally, increasingly, which is great, at the state level and in other places, is to do this work with partners. So Galveston Bay area chapter of the Master Naturalists, thank goodness you guys are doing this series. That's awesome. What I would love to see is a multi-chapter effort in the Houston Galveston region for you guys to all support each other in this work, because it is hard for one group to take all of this on and do it well. And by leaning on other groups, in this case, other chapters or other agencies, to help you figure this out, you give each other enough space and breathing room and grace to help each other out. And so I'm glad you guys are kind of in the lead in terms of local chapters and you're doing this. I have to really applaud Mohammed for really putting this together. It takes courage to do that, and it's really awesome. And so I'll just leave with that point, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions before our final poll. So let's have it. Let's have your questions.
We've got some questions, and Jaime, it was brilliant. Thank you. Okay, the first one, how do you reach diverse donors?
Yeah, that's a great question. How do you reach diverse donors? Well, I think that, with all donors, it doesn't really matter where they're coming from. Because I meet with a lot of donors. You really have to, I will tell you this. This is how I always see it. You're never going to get somebody to pay money for what you want. What you're going to do is you're going to get people to donate to activate the values they already have. You're a vehicle to get them where they want to be anyway. So if they're passionate about biodiversity, they're going to give you money for biodiversity because you can activate that. If they're passionate for justice, same deal. So you always have to be aware that you're never going to get money from a generous person because you're going to get them to do what you want, right? You're really just activating their values. So the reason I'm saying that is if you want to get more diverse donors, you're going to have to speak to their value sets and their desires, right? And so that's where you have to do some real discernment about what you want to work on, right? So it may be that, and all diverse donors are not a monolith, right? So there are diverse donors who just really care about birds, or they just care about wild spaces, and that's just their jam, and that's great. But there are many donors of color who might really be interested, or LGBTQ donors, or other, folks that might have different abilities, that might say, like, your organization, and we're seeing this increasingly with foundations, by the way, and federal government. We want to see the diversity on your board, on your staff. We want to see this reflective of the communities that you are serving. So that's increasingly becoming not a good to have, but like you must have this. So the funding for conservation and environmental stuff is shifting rapidly. And a lot of these agencies and foundations that have previously funded conservation and environmental stuff that didn't ask those demographic questions are now asking that demographic question because they want to make sure that you are speaking to a more diversified suite of people. So I think in answer to that question, I think it's listening to people, it's meeting them where they want to be and where they want to plant their money, but also getting the diversity and inclusion amped up in your organization is also going to better situate you to meet with donors and get to where they want to go as well.
All right, next question. How do I educate and encourage a 10-year-old from the inner city, like the Fifth Ward, to care about nature?
Great question. So one thing that oftentimes happened with naturalists at the Arboretum is we'd get kids from the 3rd Ward, 5th Ward, places that maybe, or experiences where maybe they weren't getting as much nature, unfortunately. So sometimes what would happen is we would have them out for a field trip, and some of our volunteers, and understandably so, I'm not making fun of anybody, but understandably so, they're like, they get back by the end of the tour and they'd say like, I don't think that kid cares about nature any more than they did, 45 minutes ago. And you have to remember that that's like one experience in a lifetime, right? So they might really get jazzed about it, but the research shows that kids have to have regular contact with nature and somebody that is an adult who's showing pro-environmental behavior. So how do you get a kid excited about nature in the 5th Ward or the 3rd Ward or River Oaks or anything? Give them nature on the daily, right? So this is part of the where conservation can lean in. I can't possibly think that a kid from a neighborhood that's not getting too much nature, and that's also wealthy kids, by the way, because they're not going outside very much, right? So it's not just communities of color or underserved communities. But I can't say like we have a state park and we're going to get them out there once they're going to have a love of nature and then no. This is where we need to lean in and say, how can we help understand nature inequity in those communities and work together with those communities to bring nature so that kids can experience this every day? Is it a schoolyard? Is it a park? Is it the trees that are lining the avenue? So everybody who's going to form an affinity for nature needs to get it almost daily or daily. So we need to think about that in terms of our role. If we really want conservation voters in the future, conservation donors, and just the thrill of people getting in contact with nature, we need to give them a variety of experiences. And that variety of experiences really starts in their neighborhood, on their street, on their school ground, right?
Okay, Jaime, our next question is, what are some initial ways to start this work?
Well, the hard truth of it is one of the best ways to start it is do an inventory of who you already have, right? Be dead honest about it, right? Because nobody's going to come and check with you immediately. A lot of groups have done this, started to do this work. There is something called Green 2.0 that's happening at the national level, where basically what they're looking at is what is the diversity of leadership and staff at all the big greens, all these big institutions like World Wildlife Fund, Nature Conservancy, Defenders of Earth, and they're looking at it. They're like, who do you have on staff that represents different backgrounds or different affinities or different, And so I think that part of it is just like if you were trying to get in shape, the first thing you need to do is figure out like, what shape are you in now, right? So you can have a baseline to understand how you're growing. I think that's one thing that's really should be done is literally take the numbers down for different kinds of diversity within your institution so you have a baseline. So you can set some goals, right? And to have it in mind that it's not just the people you serve, but it's your own institution that that needs to reflect that. So I think that that's in any conservation, take a baseline, see where you're going to go from there.
Great. Next question. What mechanisms have you used to obtain the input from the Gulfton community? Did you use town hall meetings or surveys? What did you do?
So we're pretty early in the process, but this is how it's going to work. This is going to be a marriage between science, urban planning, and community voice and empowerment. So what we have done so far is we've collected a bunch of different scientific layers to understand where nature is, what is the structure of nature, where is the biodiversity, what's the temperature of the neighborhood. We did a huge urban heat mapping project last year. Where are the floodable spots? Where are the gardens? So basically, like, where is all the nature? What kind of nature is there? Where do people walk? So are they passing nature? Where are the good sidewalks? So there's a whole bunch of scientific data that needs to be collected and then mapped so we can start to see emergent patterns. But that also needs to be allied with community forums. We're going to be doing some stuff virtually. We just did a community event, a kickoff event in the community around a trash pickup at a park and then an engagement. We just had fun activities. We did monarch gliders and seed balls and things like that. Started to talk to the people, get their kind of anecdotal notions of what nature is, what nature looked like from the country in which they came from, if they're an immigrant or if they came from another state or something like that. What is their relationship to the land, right? And we're going to have more community forums. And then we're also going to be hiring 5 community ambassadors. Their job is to be a liaison between the planning group and our steering committee, which represents different interests in the neighborhood, and the people, right? So we're paying those people because folks in these neighborhoods can't afford to just volunteer, right? So that's another thing about diversifying a volunteer corps. Some people can afford to do it and some people can't, right? Let's just be honest about that. And same thing with internships. If an institution wants more diversified interns, pay them. Don't have free or unpaid internships. I'm a perfect example. I was barely scraping by at U of H. I could have never afforded a free internship. Never. So I worked at a bookstore, right? So there are lots of ways to kind of engage the general public. What we have learned is that right now, because of COVID, that a combination of smaller in-person and virtual is what we're having to work with. And so anyway, that's where we are. And then we'll marry all that stuff together. We'll listen to community voice and they'll make final decisions, and then we'll see if we can activate funding to get some of this stuff done.
Great, thank you. Another question, scouting is a great way to connect children to the outdoors. How can we encourage more schools and churches across the area to have scouting programs, and perhaps a program aimed at training more diverse adult leaders?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I used to be an Eagle Scout merit badge counselor. This one comes down to a number. It's very complicated, and I don't know the real answer, but it comes down to less kids are spending time outdoors. That's one thing, right? Just generally. Another thing is time and money, right? Some communities literally don't have, because their parents are working 2 or 3 jobs, right? So that can be a barrier, right? Then just truthfully, the Scouts have had some issues here lately, right? So that's another thing that we have to be mindful of. And so I think it's not one thing. I think it's a combination of societal factors. I think scouting can be great. Like I said, I was a Scout merit badge counselor. And so I'm going to say I don't really have a great answer for that. I wish I did, because there are many positive things.
Chris?
We've got 2 more questions. First one, what is the diversity of master naturalists, master gardeners in the Houston-Galveston area? It seems to me that the Extension Office has excellent programs to serve the community, but they have also an opportunity to cater more to creating the next generation of members.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things there embedded. I'm learning as I'm going, like I said. So one thing that to be mindful of as a potential log under the water, and I have definitely made this mistake, so I'm just sharing what I'm learning. Sometimes when I speak to communities of color or environmental justice groups, and I say, well, brown and black people are the future of this movement here because of the numbers, and there's a perception, and I totally get it, that now these folks have not been always included in these spaces, and now we're telling them, like, now it's your job, right? So there's this feeling of like, you didn't include me, but now that you need me, now I got to do it, right? So you got to be mindful of that, and I'm learning as I go. The second thing is that I'm a honorary member of the Garden Club of Houston. I've worked with a lot of garden clubs in the area, master gardeners, lots and lots of master naturalists. And I'll just tell you, just anecdotally, I've never measured it. They're not diverse, and not diverse in terms of age, because people who are retired have more, time to volunteer. They're not diverse ethnically for the most part. It's not reflective of the massive diversity that we have here. And sometimes, like I said, when I first started this conversation, sometimes it's about who are you seeing when you go to a meeting. So if you go to a meeting of some of these groups, you're like, I don't see anybody like me. This is a little bit, this is a little bit different. I may not feel super comfortable here, right? So it is a little bit, so you have to unfortunately, you have to gain some diversity to retain some diversity, if that makes sense. So, I think that master naturalists and garden clubs and folks like that, I think the first step is not to say, we have all these wonderful programs, we're going to bring them to this community, right? It's to first listen, see what opportunities might exist, what overlap, what Venn diagram might exist in terms of their values and their interest, your knowledge and your interests and your values, and be willing to step away. So if there is no intersectionality there, sometimes people try to force it and that doesn't work. So what you have to say is like, we tried, but there wasn't a shared desire there, and that's okay. Sometimes you'll find the shared desire and then you move on from there. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to be more reflective, but it really starts with listening, and then also advertising these opportunities in more diversified channels. So one of the things that we're really working to do at TNC is to understand that different folks get their information and their job descriptions or their volunteer descriptions in different channels. So if you're not getting a diversified suite of candidates, maybe do a little research into where more diverse candidates might get information about volunteerism or jobs or internships. That has proven to be very important to us because we kept on using the same old channels, getting the same result. And we're like, nobody's, we can't find diverse candidates. As soon as you start finding more diversified channels, you start finding that there are more people interested. So that's also an important thing.
All righty, final question here. It's kind of a two-part here. It's what is intersectionality? And the second part is, how does somebody, if they want to contact you, Jaime, what's the best way?
Yeah, the best way to contact me is I'm going to put my email in the chat. In terms of intersectionality, I'm sorry I used jargon there. Basically, what it means is that there are multiple processes happening at one time. Sometimes we don't see those. We see one thing happening, and then we don't see the other thing, but they actually feed off of one another, right? So for instance, systemic racism caused disinvestment in some communities. Well, the intersectionality there is, as we provided less green space and less park space and less trees, the result was biodiversity tanked. That's a good example of intersectionality, right? So you have these, oftentimes in a very complex world, you have all of these loops feeding into each other. And the closer we look at land and nature, the closer you see that it's not as simple as just the ecosystems or the biodiversity. There's a lot of human power and economics and justice dynamics that is mixed all up in there. And so the fastest way to not understand the system is to just break out one piece and think that you're looking at the whole thing. That makes sense.
All right. Thank you so much, Jaime. That was the end of questions, and I'm turning it over to Pam. Thank you.
Jaime, did you want to finish up with your last survey question here?
Yeah, it's up here. You guys see it?
Yes.
Yeah, so got some really great comments here. Got 11 comments. Joining the circle, so preservation and justice is separate approaches with common ends. And frankly, at some point, hopefully this will be just one movement where we're trying to create healthy places for everything that's alive, right? Listen, yes. Reach out to youth. Develop a process with Houston Audubon Society, engage with some of the organizations mentioned as partners, absolutely. And actually, Helen Drummond over there is leading some really good discussions and work around diversity now. So I'm really happy that Audubon is getting involved. Look for opportunities, think what's possible, and where you can connect with others. And that, I think that's a really great point. Part of the goodness of having a diversified leadership in terms of life experience, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religious affiliation, all these things, is many of those folks are going to have ideas that never would have arisen if you had a less diverse leadership or staff. They're coming from different places. They have different ideas. Some of them are just radically different and beautifully, wonderfully different. You know what I mean? So one of the advantages for the sustainability and power of an institution is that if you bring in more diversified people, they're going to bring a whole suite of cool things that you've never thought of, right? We don't all have the same experiences and shape opinions we have right now. Absolutely true. And that's even true on the personal level, right? Be aware where someone comes from. Master Naturalists offer wild camps in more areas in Houston, Galveston area. Wonder how much in order to change this to proceed outreach. This right here, this is super important. Whoever put this up. This, a perceptual change, lays the framework like a garden for changes. Sometimes people want to get busy and they just want to do outreach and they're like, we're going to teach these people about nature. Sometimes self-reflection, listening to yourself in your own institution is what is most important to begin this. Being honest about where you guys are. If you want diversity, you need to ask over and over and be welcoming and interest in others who are different from you and be willing to learn from them, you know, as an extension. So much to consider for blending diversity, especially with ethnic values. Yeah. And sometimes in the conservation movement, we're also, you know, we're also afraid to have some conversations because, you know, a lot of times we center ourselves as scientific institutions, and I think that we're values-based institutions that use science. There's a little bit of difference there. That we're afraid of crossing over that boundary for religion because there's this perceived disjunction between the two. But if anybody had moral authority, and I'm not advocating for religion, what I am saying is if a group had moral authority in communities, it's oftentimes that religious institution. So you don't have to agree or disagree, but you have to know who is a decision maker and who is an influencer in that community. And a lot of times it is communities of faith, right? Because they hold that moral authority. Sometimes it's a block captain. Sometimes, so one other thing about diversity is get to those influencers, right? If you can interest them because you're speaking to their needs and their values and things like that, they can help bring over more people, right? So sometimes figuring out and being in real authentic conversations with communities to figure out who are the people that are the trendsetters and the influencers and enter into an authentic dialogue with that person or those people or that institution is one of the ways to get involved in this and take it a little bit deeper.
Thank you so much, Jaime. This has just been marvelous dialogue to help us start thinking and start moving towards some of this. I think part of what you're saying is represented by what Mohammed has done as being someone who has brought in a diverse voice to our organization. And we're already reaping the benefit of that diversity. And so that's been wonderful. Our next presentation, we're planning for sometime in January. The exact date, the exact topic is still being finalized, but we will be sending out invitations to all of you to join us. We hope to follow Jaime's suggestion and join with some of our other master naturalists, master gardeners, some of the other naturalist organizations in the area to start joining us in presenting these, because that is what we want, is a larger dialogue and to be able to increase our ability to make progress on these issues. So thank you very much. As you leave, you will be given an opportunity to answer a short questionnaire about the presentation. Please do that. It'll help us plan for the future to make it better, to make it suit your needs better. Thank you all and good night.